Okay, so this whole idea of a potential union between the Orthodox and Catholic churches, it's a lot to unpack, right? Especially with this Nicaea 2025 thing looming on the horizon.
Yeah, no kidding. And it seems like every time you turn around, there's another layer of complexity to consider. You've got some great articles here to deep dive into, by the way.
Thanks. Yeah, when I first heard about Nicaea 2025, I have to admit I was a little surprised. Like, wait a minute, didn't these churches split like centuries ago? I vaguely remember something about a big schism back in the Middle Ages.
You're right. You're right. It was 1054, to be exact. The Great Schism, they call it,
Yep.
formally divided the Eastern and Western churches.
Right, of course, the Great Schism. See, this is why I need an expert to walk me through this stuff. So that was it then, the end of the line for church unity.
Well, not quite. Even before the Great Schism, there were already centuries of tension and disagreement brewing. Theological debates, power struggles, cultural differences, you name it.
So this whole Nicaea 2025 thing, it's not the first attempt at a do-over?
Not even close.
Hmm.
It's interesting you should mention that, actually. Back in the 7th century, Emperor Heraclius tried to bridge the divide with something called monoenergism.
Mono what now? That's a new one on me.
It is a theological concept, tried to find some middle ground between different interpretations of Christ's will. Let's just say it didn't really pan out as planned.
So historically speaking, trying to get these two churches to play nice hasn't exactly been a walk in the park.
That's putting it mildly. And here's another wrinkle for you. It's not even like Orthodoxy presents a united front, you know?
What do you mean?
You've got World Orthodoxy, which follows the revised Gregorian calendar, and then you've got True Orthodoxy, sometimes called Old Calendarists. They stick with the Julian calendar.
So even within Orthodoxy, there are different branches, different interpretations.
Exactly. It's like trying to get everyone in a family to agree on, well, anything, really. Complicated history, complicated present.
Speaking of complicated, one of the articles you had me read mentioned this idea of ecumenism of the left and ecumenism of the right. I'll be honest, that one threw me for a loop.
Yeah, it's a fascinating concept, isn't it? Basically, it highlights how shared political values, rather than just theological ones, are playing a bigger role in some of these modern ecumenical efforts.
So instead of focusing solely on doctrinal agreement, it's about finding common ground on things like social justice or political ideology.
Precisely. You might have liberal Catholics feeling a stronger sense of solidarity with liberal Protestants, or even those of other faiths, than they do with more conservative members of their own church.
Right, because in today's climate, sometimes those shared political views can feel more important than theological differences.
It's true. And it makes you wonder how much of that is influencing this push for union between the Orthodox and Catholic churches. Is it about genuine spiritual unity, or are there other agendas at play?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we've got centuries of historical baggage, internal divisions within Orthodoxy itself, and now this whole question of whether political motivations are muddying the waters. Where do we even go from here? What are the main sticking points that are actually preventing these two churches from unifying?
Well, a lot of people point to the papacy as the biggest roadblock, right? That whole issue of papal infallibility and the authority of the Pope.
Yeah, it's not exactly a small theological difference, is it?
Not at all. But from what I gathered from these articles, the real sticking point goes even deeper than that. We're talking about a fundamentally different understanding of the Trinity itself.
Okay, now we're getting into the theological nitty-gritty. I'll admit, I'm a little rusty on my Trinitarian doctrine. What exactly are we talking about here?
Well, for starters, there's the filioque.
Vaguely rings a bell. Remind me again why that one's such a big deal for the Orthodox.
Okay, so basically it's that whole debate about adding "and the Son" to the Nicene Creed, the part describing the Holy Spirit as proceeding from the Father and the Son.
Right, the filioque.
Exactly. And for the Orthodox, it's not just about adding a few words to a creed, you see. They view it as changing the entire understanding of the Trinity. Like, it implies that the Holy Spirit originates from both the Father and the Son, instead of solely from the Father, as they believe.
So it's like these two churches are working from two slightly different blueprints when it comes to the Trinity, and that difference kind of ripples outward, affecting everything else.
That's a great way to put it. And it's not just the filioque either. There's also the Orthodox emphasis on the energies essence distinction.
Okay, you're going to have to break that one down for me. Energy's essence distinction.
So in a nutshell, the Orthodox believe that while God's essence is ultimately beyond our human comprehension, we can still experience him through his energies, his actions in the world. Think of it like the sun. You can't look directly at the sun's core, right? Too bright, too powerful. But you can still experience the sun's energy through its light and warmth.
Ah, okay. I'm starting to get it. So for the Orthodox, God's essence is this mystery, but we can still have a relationship with him through what he does in the world.
Exactly. But this whole distinction, which is central to Orthodox theology, it's not really there in Catholic doctrine. And that's a major obstacle to any real unification.
It's like trying to put together a puzzle when the pieces are from two completely different boxes.
I like that analogy.
Mm.
And even if by some miracle they did manage to overcome these theological hurdles, there's still the massive task of figuring out how these two churches, each with their own unique traditions and practices, would actually function as one unified body.
It's funny you should say that because one thing I kept thinking about as I read these articles was this idea of a unilateral declaration of union. Honestly, it sounds kind of crazy, like something out of a movie.
It has that ring to it, doesn't it?
Hmm.
And it kind of highlights this potential disconnect between like theological ideals and the messy reality of trying to merge two very different communities.
So, in layman's terms, what exactly is a unilateral declaration of union? How would that even work?
Basically, it'd be one side saying, we consider ourselves united, whether you're on board or not.
Wow. Talk about a power move.
Right. Bold move,
Yeah.
to say the least. And it would probably create a whole new set of problems.
Yeah, no kidding. It's not like you can just force a bunch of people to be unified, right? So, is that even a realistic possibility, this unilateral declaration, or is it just like a thought experiment?
Who knows at this point? But it does make you think, doesn't it?
Hmm.
Especially when you consider how differently the Orthodox and Catholic churches view things like the sacraments.
How so?
Well, for Catholics, there's a way for Orthodox Christians to receive communion in their churches, and vice versa, with certain conditions, of course. But for a lot of Orthodox believers, taking communion in a Catholic church is a big no-no.
Really?
Oh yeah, we're talking potential grounds for excommunication, like you're basically abandoning the faith.
Wow. So even something like sharing communion, something that should represent unity, becomes a point of division. It's pretty telling, I think.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it just goes to show how deep this divide runs, this whole push for union. It's about more than just hashing out theological details in a room somewhere. It's about two very different ways of experiencing faith, two very different worlds trying to become one. And that's never going to be easy.
So where do we go from here? It almost feels like we're talking about two ships passing in the night, each one headed towards a different destination.
It's a powerful image, and it really gets at the heart of what true ecumenism should even look like.
Yeah.
I mean, are we talking about just kind of glossing over huge differences for some superficial sense of unity? Or is it about acknowledging the very real and very different experiences of these two churches and respecting their separate journeys?
It makes you think, doesn't it? Because I'll be honest, I think when most people hear ecumenism, they automatically think, oh, that's a good thing. Different faiths coming together, trying to find common ground. But what you're suggesting is that real, true ecumenism might actually involve acknowledging, maybe even honoring those differences, right?
It definitely requires a more nuanced perspective, that's for sure. One of the articles you sent mentioned something that really stuck with me. It said that the original understanding of ecumenism, way back in the early church, it wasn't about treating other faiths as equals at all. It was about approaching them as potential converts.
Wow, that's a pretty different way of looking at things.
It is, isn't it? And it kind of throws a wrench in our modern sensibilities. But it gets to the heart of what's at stake here. To quote one of the articles you provided directly, it said, "For there to be a union between the Orthodox East and Catholic West, the Orthodox or the Catholic faith must perish."
That's a pretty stark assessment. It makes this whole Nicaea 2025 thing feel like less of an academic debate and more like, well, an existential question for these ancient branches of Christianity.
It's a matter of profound consequence, no doubt. And it raises the question, what will the future of Christianity look like? Will it be a future of unity, of
Ye-
diversity, or something else entirely?
It's a lot to process. I'll admit I have more questions now than I did when we started, but I feel like at least now I'm asking the right kinds of questions.
That's what matters. Because these are tough questions, and there aren't any easy answers. But engaging with these questions thoughtfully and respectfully, that's what matters.
Absolutely. So to our listeners, we'll leave you with this. As we watch this story of a potential unification continue to unfold, how will you choose to view it? Through the lens of hope, of skepticism, or somewhere in between. We've given you the historical and theological background. Now you decide what it all means.